Anyway, so enough about that. So Module 3, you are going to be reading Spring Chapter 3, and he titles this one, Nationalism, Multiculturalism, and something in the New Republic, something like that. I really think a better, or at least a subtitle, would have been something about, what are views of education in post-revolutionary United States. Okay, we fought the Revolutionary War. America fought the Revolutionary War. I say we, you know, the United States came into a time when they decided that, again, because a democracy requires intelligent, educated citizens to be an electorate, okay, that they're going to tie the school system and education, so a public education, to the political system. How do you support a republic, a truly democratic republic? Well, you've got to have citizens who are capable of supporting that kind of a government. All right. He he talks a little bit about that. He also says that there's some world culture theorists that would argue that America led the way with regard to tying their educational system to their political system in order to support it. The best method then for preparing future citizens, what is it? And there are some interesting ideas that he talks about in post-revolutionary United States. What do we do about cultural diversity? And there's been cultural diversity in this country since the very beginning. There were always slaves here, and there were always people from other ethnicities. They may be all European ethnicities, but they spoke different languages. Some of them, there were Germans, there were Dutch, there were all kinds of different cultures. There were different religions, albeit mainly Christian, but there were different denominations of religions. So they kind of argued about what should be, their cultures did clash. So if you have an educational system that is going to basically concentrate on bringing all of these cultures together and having them be loyal to this new republic, to this country, how do you do that? So these questions have been asked from the very beginning, and this is obviously an issue that is still asked today. So that's interesting to see kind of some of the history of that. This is not new, and I think that's a surprise for some people. Okay, so he talks a little bit about Noah Webster and Thomas Jefferson and some of their ideas. It's very interesting, again, to see those ideas because they're part of tying education to a political system and having an educated electorate. And, Noah Webster is famous for saying something along the lines of, let the infant in the cradle, his first words, let him lisp George Washington, or something like that. So history was always very important to both of these guys, Thomas Jefferson as well. And I think that's interesting, being a social studies teacher, myself a history teacher. I was a history teacher for 14 years in the public school system, and I watched it from the time that I began teaching prior to NCLB, No Child Left Behind. I watched it slowly be marginalized, and I still see that today, that it's still kind of marginalized and put off to the side today. I think Thomas Jefferson and Noah Webster would probably have a heart attack if they saw what was happening to social studies and civic education, but that's my personal opinion. Okay, so another couple of things. There's a small PowerPoint, a short PowerPoint for you to view that kind of summarizes some of the interesting aspects of this chapter, but not all of them by any means. Faculty psychology. This was where they believed that the brain was sort of like a muscle, and if you exercise certain aspects of the brain, then it would get stronger, and you had to do that. So, again, the ideas about education during this time were a lot of rote memorization because of their views of what they believed the brain capable of doing. And I suppose that there's something to be said for this. Yes, you need to use your brain to keep it, I think they found with Alzheimer's research that you need to do these types of things, but it's certainly nowhere near what they're sort of, should I use the word primitive? They're sort of primitive ideas about psychology and how the brain worked at the time. And then there was this concept of sort of this different ideas of childhood, different conceptions of childhood. I think that's a very important part of the chapter to definitely read, because this sort of idea of a protected childhood where children should be able to be innocent and free and, have, I guess, this idyllic sort of childhood where they don't have to deal with the hardness and harshness of life. This is a very different idea in recent years, probably since about the 1950s. We have this idea that children have this protected childhood. Well, some children never have this protected childhood, and certainly not in the United States even since the 50s. If you're talking about people in lower socioeconomic strata, certainly African Americans in the South, during this time frame, many of their children did not have a protected childhood. So it's important to remember that this is a relatively new idea, and children around the turn of the century, the 19th century, the 20th century, the 1900s, they were working in industrial factories for 10 hours a day, 6 days a week. So that was certainly not a protected childhood either. And then many children on farms, were working from the time they got up in the morning. There were many children raised by single mothers because many fathers died, and the same with mothers. Many mothers died in childbirth. So this idea that there's a single parent household, that's honestly kind of that's not a new thing either, considering death rates in previous times. So that's all something to think about in spring. In Ravitch and in Darling Hammond, in chapter 1, it's essentially an introduction to their book. They're both of their chapter 1s. And Diane Ravitch is an interesting character because she, for a very long period of time, was a proponent of many of these current day issues in education that she is now very vehemently against. Market-based reforms, we call them. Neoliberal reforms, they're sometimes called as well. Don't let that name fool you, because neoliberal doesn't mean, it's really not tied to the word liberal. It's tied to more of this market-based reform idea where you let the market be free. The educational system should benefit from being run like a corporation, being run like a company. You should privatize. You should have charter schools. You should have vouchers. You should have, choice, school choice. The curriculum should be standardized across the board. It should all be measured. The accountability. How should teachers' effectiveness be measured? Should it be measured by the test scores of their students, which is a very problematic issue that you're going to learn a lot more about this particular semester? Because at first blush, that seems like just a logical idea. Why shouldn't we judge teachers based on the scores of their students? That makes sense. How well did you do your job? Did I teach my students what I was supposed to teach over the course of the year? But you'll find that it's much more problematic than that. Anyway, so Ravitch essentially does a total 180. She changes her mind because she sees that these things don't work, and I think she explains that very well in that first chapter. And then of course Darling Hammond, in a little, she certainly backs up all of her statements. She's writing more for a scholarly audience, I think, in her book. So hers is going to be a little more dry. I understand it can be a little boring at times, but there's a lot of really important information in there. So, pay attention to the way she presents her arguments and her statistics, because it's very convincing. And again, she's a very influential voice in public policy for education these days. Again, she was President Obama's first choice to be Department Secretary of Education, but she did not end up being that in the end. Anyway, so she focuses on educational inequality. She's going to talk a little bit about how America's falling behind because of the test scores. If you compare them to other countries, which others will argue you're comparing apples and oranges, these are totally different systems, but there's still something to be learned there about what she has to say. And then, of course, you'll notice that her focus is going to be predominantly on teachers and how well they are prepared, and that across just about any measure of educational effectiveness, you're going to find that having the best prepared, educated, trained teachers are going to increase those measures of effectiveness, whether it be test scores or, or whatever measure you choose to gauge how well students are doing in a classroom, she would argue that it's always going to be tied back to a very well prepared teacher, and not a teacher, for example, in Teach for America or one of these type of programs where you just prepare a teacher for 6 weeks over the summer and then you let them loose the next school year. So understand her background and where she's coming from. So then for the assignments, you're going to answer the discussion post and then respond to one of your classmates' discussion posts. And I've been enjoying reading those. Those are actually very, you're really coming up with some good points, and I think you guys are starting to get some of, the important ideas and aspects about what we're going to be talking about this semester. And then you have a journal response number 2 that you're going to answer. So I think that's it for this particular module. And if you have any questions about anything, and again, I hope that we figured out some of the issues with your availability for module 2. So please contact me again if you have any other issues. All right.